My name is Wendy Norris, and I am a firefighter and a fire service emergency services chaplain located down in the Houston, Texas area. So we are in the same state as you, Trey, or I'm in the same state as you. I have been in the fire service, I want to say since I was 5, because I've always wanted to be a firefighter since I was little bitty. I like to say that came from being nosy as opposed to the the adventure part of it. I always wanted to know what was going on down the street because we had this senior living facility. Of course, it was 5, so it was probably maybe 40-year-olds, maybe our age range, and they just looked old to a 5-year-old. But I think they were senior citizens because there were always fire trucks and ambulances that were down there, and I would go running after them, ask them all kinds of questions, and they were kind enough to let me play with the radio and the stethoscopes, and that was where it was really born in my heart to become a firefighter. And so I was able to do that in high school and then went to the fire academy and kind of grew into that profession. And in August of 1997, I was involved in a pretty catastrophic fire that actually caused a career ending injury when I had a roof collapse on top of me and burned my lungs and gave me a brain injury. And so had a couple of years of recovery from that, but it was really a catalyst for really the first piece of trauma that I could identify in my life. And I had a lot in my family's origin and how I grew up, but I never really attached to that until actually pretty recently. Um, so when the doctor had come in and said, "You're no longer able to be a firefighter," it was devastating because I had wanted to do that since I was 5. And so I ended up being able to put my foot back in the door by starting an organization here in Texas called the Texas Line of Duty Death Task Force. And what that is an organization that cares for families and agencies of fallen first responders or fire, police, EMS dispatchers that die protecting their communities. And then recently, we've brought on caring for those families that have lost a first responder to suicide, which we're seeing an increased number in that as well. And so I've been operating that going on 22 years now, which makes me feel really old. But also in my recovery process too, I was able to get to the point where I was able to go back and do chaplaincy training and work specifically with first responders, and am part of a fire department doing all the things a firefighter can do except for going inside of a burning building. Although every once in a while I try. And then I also do the chaplaincy piece for that fire department too. So God has been very kind to me in being able to keep my foot in the door of doing things that I love, and also giving me new things to do as far as the chaplaincy and mental health and caring for people. Day-to-day pieces of our daily life really impact us as a first responder because of the big T traumas that we see and we respond to. And earlier before we were recording, we were talking about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. And so a lot of what first responders are going through is exactly that. They are witnessing another person's trauma. And so if we're dealing with a car accident or we're dealing with flooding, because I'm down here in Harvey land, that we like to call it. And then also we had a school shooting down here not too far from me. And so the first responders that had to go to that, those are all secondary traumas that we are witnessing, but can cause some of the same reactions for us as well. And so we're exposed to lots of different traumas, and understanding that there are those little T traumas that we deal with on a daily basis can snowball into big traumas that we're living through ourselves. For me, for example, with Hurricane Harvey, although our house thankfully didn't flood, a lot of homes around us did flood, and we were still having to go through and provide care and provide response and rescue people in the midst of all of this. So the trauma is happening in real time to myself because we're in the middle of it, but then we're also responding to other traumas that are going on to the people that we're rescuing or the people that have gotten injured during that. So there's all these little pieces of trauma that really kind of fit together to create the whole. And so for first responders who are day in and day out exposed to that secondary trauma, those little pieces that come from our daily lives, the stress of just having a family or the stress of just living in the world itself, having to pay the bills or having to deal with difficult relationships, those type of things can really impact the resilience of a first responder. And pastors are first responders alongside of us when we are going through very rough situations. And so, again, being in Texas with Hurricane Harvey, with COVID, with the shootings that we've had, and unfortunately in Texas, we've had 5 mass shootings. And all of those circumstances, and we have a lot of wildland fires that are taking place actually currently right now. Um, those pastors in those communities are the first ones to open up their church doors. They're the first ones to be able to start bringing like setting up shelters, setting up places to come and eat, setting up mucking out stations to go out and clean out houses. Pastors are always the first. And during Hurricane Harvey, we had one particular area that we could bring people to. Everything else was flooded, and it was a church. It was one of our local churches. And it was just amazing to have that relationship, to know that we're all flooded out at the same time and we're going out and rescuing people to bring them to a church that is surrounded by water, and that the pastor had to endanger his life to even get there. So that's what it really is all about, is that we have to start recognizing that pastors on the front lines, or individuals that go on the front lines to minister to people in disasters, are doing frontline work, which is a term we've heard a lot over the last couple of years with COVID. We talked about COVID, especially. I think that was the point that, you and I had this conversation earlier during the cohort about just how impacted and really hurt pastors were, local pastors were, and providing care to their constituents and to their community and to the people that attended their church, because they could do nothing. So even with Hurricane Harvey, they were willing to risk their lives to come open up churches and provide meals and whatnot. But with COVID, they weren't allowed to do anything. And so that provided this sense of loss and not belonging and isolation in a completely different way than the average citizen felt that. And so that really brought a whole nother level of trauma to the local individuals, pastors or frontline workers that couldn't do the work until later on down the line. And that was legitimately where we saw a lot of hurt take place within our local communities.
Yes.
I remember the very first medical call that we made when COVID hit and all of the isolation had started taking place and all the protocols started happening. And we had switched before. If we had in firefighting, we're not doing fires all the time, believe it or not. Most of our calls are EMS, like the toe hurting at 3 a.m. calls. We get mostly EMS calls. And so when we would go, even if it was a toe hurting at 3 o'clock in the morning, we go as a team. There's like 10 of us squished inside of a living room looking at this injured toe, and we're all looking at each other, but we're there together as a team, because you never know what's going to happen inside that house. You never know what's going to happen inside of whatever incident that you're responding to. And so, again, you go, we go, we're all there together. So if something happens, we're all there together. So when COVID hit, it changed dramatically. What we had to do was we sent one person in and everybody else had to stay outside. All of our medical equipment was outside, and we would have to pass whatever it was they needed into that person to that person. And only if it was a severe enough emergency that required 2 or 3 people, then we would send that person in, the secondary third person. So the very first call that we made was a COVID related call, and we sent the one person in, and all of us on the outside were just dying inside. It was just the worst feeling because we felt like we were leaving a person behind. We didn't know what was happening. What if we had to protect them? And it was a moral injury in the aspect of it is going against everything that we are taught as first responders to go in and help. And this is the yellow canary that we've sent in, and we don't know if the yellow canary is going to survive in there or not. All of those pieces had kind of come into play. And what I found is, even though I was experiencing that same feeling, the more that I got my first responders to talk to each other, relive it, and talk about what they were feeling and the anxiety they were feeling, the fear that they were feeling, and what they were thinking in those moments, the more that we talked about it, the more it compartmentalized it and normalized it and filed it away in a correct place into the brain. And so it relieved a lot of that anxiety in the days and weeks to come. And so when we are faced with something, being able to have a relationship with somebody else who understands the similarities of our journey is so crucial to our healing and our ability to have resilience. And it's important to have those relationships ahead of time and not in the moment when you need them, because that's the hardest to have that relationship with. Yeah, let me just add a caveat to that
Sure.
across the board, not even just talking about counselor or let's say therapist, not just talking about our pastors and first responders, but anybody in a leadership position was prevented from leading their people in the way that they were used to leading their people. And so you would have CEOs or managers or supervisors that once were very hands on, even if they were just in an office within the building, but they were still within feet from their people, could no longer be in that space. And so, really, across the board, anybody that was in a leadership position or a helping position were prevented from doing exactly what they were called to do or meant to do, which caused a lot of strife for a lot of people. So, just across the board, knowing that there were a lot of people in that space. And depending on what number again you are on the Enneagram, like me being a three and I know you're a three, we like to stuff that stuff down. If it's an emotion or a feeling, we're stuffing that. We're not. We'll get back to that later on. And so sometimes people may not even recognize that they are grieving something that they've lost during COVID. And so you can have grief, and the grief needs to be recognized, and the grief needs to be worked on, because then it becomes unresolved, which could become complicated, which could become very difficult to treat later on and to deal with, really, in trying to recover. You can have grief without trauma, but you cannot have trauma without grief. And you really have to be able to handle both of those and separate both of those things out. How do I deal with the grief piece and how do I deal with the trauma piece? So when you were talking about earlier these pastors that could not do death notifications, or they could not hold a funeral, or they could not go into the hospital to do sick visits, that is a pretty big trauma for that individual, because they're not able to do this thing where they're able to comfort other people. So they have to pull those two pieces apart and realize I am grieving my work that I was able to do and standing alongside of other people who are grieving. So I have to deal with that grief component of time lost with the flock that I shepherd. But my trauma with the anxiety of not being able to do that work, the hopelessness, the helplessness, all of those things have to be dealt with too. So you can see that they're two different things, but they go kind of hand in hand. And so understanding where you're at in your number on your Enneagram, and knowing where you go to in a place of stress and a place of security, is so crucial to your ability to be able to bounce back and to go on to the next thing, because we know it's coming. In the work of a pastor and the work that your organization is doing in supporting pastors and leaders, we know it's coming. We know that there's going to be some other crisis. There's going to be some other hurt that we're going to have to deal with. And so we have to be able to do the work of resilience. And what I want to point out with resilience too, it's not something that is happening in the now. It's actually something that you've worked on previously too. Resilience really is building that support system around you, like we were talking about, knowing who your peers are, who can you go to, how are you taking care of yourself, building those coping skills so that when you are up against something, you're able to deal with that situation with more ease, without the panic, without as much anxiety or stress. Because when you're able to do that, you're able to actually find the hope, and you're able to help yourself more into getting out of the really thick, hard places of trauma and loss. And so when you look at your stress number, you can see that when you are going through that crisis or you're going through that trauma in the moment, doing the Enneagram work and actually going through the cohort, and then coming back to my daily life as a first responder, or just in daily life trauma, I can see exactly where going to that place of stress, if I do it in a healthy way, actually helps me get through the moment, gets me through that stressful period of time. And so instead of going to complete sloth as a nine and just hiding and isolating and wanting to hunker down, I can instead allow myself the place of rest for a little bit so I can come back and do the work the next day. And so I think it's important to really be able to, as you're building your own resiliency to face the next stressor, or to deal with it in the here and now, is to really study where you go, where those lines are, and what looks healthy. Because the nine stress for us, or the stress space for us, it can be healthy if you do it in the right way. And it could help you in the here and now. Whereas in your place of security, that's where you're building the actual resiliency for the future. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense to you and
Good.
to I for sure. And I think that's one thing I'll draw folks back to the wisdom of the Enneagram is that if you're unfamiliar with the Enneagram or just barely familiar with the Enneagram, it's not just that it gives you this type and you're this personality. It can teach you something about coping and about how you cope. And I love what you said just now. I'd never heard it put that way. That we can, the resources for learning resilience, for building up the savings account, the emergency fund, if you will, for when resilience is called upon, is found in leaning into our security move. Um, that's fantastic wisdom. And so I hope if you're watching this video right now, you scribble that down because I will be. That
It
is
takes a
really,
lot of
really good.
practice. It takes a lot of practice because when you go into your daily life, when you're in kind of the humdrum of just doing the everyday thing, and we are in kind of that boring period, it's hard actually to lean into that place of security too, and do those things that are required of us in that security move. And so sometimes we actually have to push ourselves, and that may be coming from a person of independent stance. It may be a lot easier. So that may be, let me just say, that's probably a bias, but it can be hard for us to go in either way and really practice those things. And so I really encourage people to go back and study that place of security and also that place of stress, and work on those things and try to do those things and practice those things, because we have what we call muscle memory within the first responder world, that we train and we train and we train. And so when it comes up on us, it's like this: we make the decision instantly because our body knows how to do it. And so it's the same thing as we practice, practice, practice how to rest. And then when we need it, we know how to do it in a right and proper way. And then we know how to have fun, and we know how to, just have a, self care, all those things that come with the security piece. We have to practice.